Call a public hearing to order. Roll call, please.
Alderman Knight.
Here.
Alderman Coles.
Here.
Alderman Isaac.
Here.
Alderman Shockey.
Here.
Alderman Subak.
Here.
Alderman Talmy.
Here.
Alderman Winger. Here. Alderman Wesley.
Here.
Mayor Johnson.
Here. Quorum is present. The notice was duly published in the appropriate newspaper pursuant to statute. This is the public hearing on the budget for fiscal year 2006, 2007. I'm going to ask Maggie Powers if she'll give a brief overview of the budget at this time.
Just give a few short slides. As you know, the general fund, before we changed some revenues, had about $569,000 deficit by raising the building permit fees, the vehicle sticker fees, and the business license fees. We got that down to a deficit of $130,234. Comparing the budget for this, the general fund budget for this year and this coming year and the year that we're in now, the total expenditures are only 3.8% higher. And the staffing levels actually are a negative 1.4 people. If you recall, when we did those personnel statistics, we added one police officer, but we had several people take the early retirement incentive from IMRF. And then even with the city service additions of an engineer and an engineering tech, and we added one part-time individual to handle the video services at these meetings, we still actually are down 1.4 staff people. However, all departments believe that they can operate effectively at those staffing levels. On the special revenue funds, total expenditures for those funds is up 19.3%. That's primarily due to the expenditures in the motor fuel tax fund. Some of that is capital projects transfers, and the rest of it is the rental of those public works vehicles. If you'll recall, last year, we determined that we could replace some of the city service vehicles that needed replacement by leasing them, because IDOT will approve leases. They will not approve purchases with motor fuel tax money. And also, we've had several projects go into the tourism fund this year that increase those expenditures. But both of those funds, the motor fuel tax fund and the tourism fund, end up with positive fund balances. I don't know why my slide won't. There we go. Enterprise funds, actually expenditures decreased 8% when compared to last year's budget, and that's primarily due to a decrease in water sewer projects, which have been deferred to future years. The last slide I have, which I can't seem to get. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. This is how we end up with all the funds. I'd like to go through this carefully with you because I know there's some misunderstandings about how municipal accounting actually works. There's a thing called fund balance in most of the funds for the city of Wooddale. That represents cash and investments, accounts receivable, and it's reduced by any current liabilities like accounts payable that we have. So that fund balance is carried forward from year to year, similar to you carrying a cash balance in your checking account. The only difference here is because we have these numbers at a particular date and time, and obviously we are receiving invoices all the time, so those become accounts payable. And when we send bills out to people, we send them out and recognize the revenue, but we don't always collect the cash. So it's a moving target. But the revenue for the general fund, we're estimating at $10,736,087, and the expenditures at $10,866,321. That shows a deficit, and all a deficit is expenditures greater than revenues. All right? But notice on the far right column, fund balance, we still end up with a positive fund balance. That's because this is a continuum. The fund balance keeps getting carried forward. Obviously, it gets reduced by deficits, and it gets increased when there's a surplus. So anything you see in red there is a deficit. But let me call your attention to the motor fuel tax fund. The reason why that deficit is large for this proposed year is because in the current year that we're in, that ends April 30th of 2006, we did not make the transfers to the capital projects funds that were originally budgeted. And that's because the project didn't take place this year. So we deferred it to next year. As a matter of fact, we collect about the same amount of revenue every single year in the motor fuel tax fund, and the city has been saving that up, and it's been reflected in fund balance for several years. So that is not anything to be alarmed about. You'll see that the ending fund balance is a little more than 1 year's worth of motor fuel tax revenue. Same situation in the narcotics forfeiture fund. It's a $1,000 deficit. Well, we have money in the fund of $17,822. The only time we receive anything in narcotics forfeiture is when the various governments who dispense these funds finally decide to dispense them to Wooddale. We have no way of knowing when those funds come. We do know that we're going to spend about $2,000 on the police dog, which is a program that's ongoing. So it shows a deficit for the current year, but certainly plenty of fund balance. The problem with narcotics forfeiture funds is you can only use them for narcotics enforcement. So those funds aren't available to be used to pay anything else, except things related to narcotics enforcement. Capital Projects Fund, same situation there. The Capital Projects Fund receives utility taxes and some fund transfers from the general fund, and we're estimating revenues at about 2.1 million, and the projects for the year will be 2.4 million. In this instance, and this is the only fund that I would say is, I don't even want to use the word jeopardized, but the only fund that's very lean is the Capital Projects Fund, because that $644,000 ending fund balance is pretty much restricted to the Build Illinois grant that was received by the city several years ago. That is to cover the Irving Park Metro project. So there's probably $1,000 that would be available cash to be spent, but essentially there won't be any more monies in the Capital Projects Fund until the year 2007-08. Commuter parking lot, another good example where money's been saved. We're going to spend $498,000 this year. There are two big projects in there. One is the station area study, and the other one is actually the remodeling of the train station. A lot of that is being funded by grants, but some of the money is going to come in only after we make the expenditure. We may not even see some of that revenue until 2007, 2008, when the project's done and we get reimbursed. So there's still plenty of fund balance in that fund at the end of 2007, at April 30th of 2007. Finally, I want to call your attention to special service area. This is going to look strange to you for the next 20 years, and here's why. In this current year, we collected about $9 million in bond proceeds, and we're going to be showing that for the year ending April 30th of 06 as revenue. And all we spent out of that fund this whole year were debt service payments on some old special service areas and a little bit of interest on these new bond issues. So there's going to be a huge surplus. That's what you'll see on the financial statements and in the audit. Next year, we're going to do some construction, and some of the subsequent year, we have no idea yet how much construction can be done because the bids aren't even finished yet. We may end up amending this budget and showing $2 or $3 million of expenditures. And you won't see any revenue except for a little interest income and some of the property taxes on the old special service areas that are still being paid off. So through the years, you're going to see 1 year where you have lots of revenue and then hardly any expense. Then you're going to see a bunch of years where you'll get some revenue and huge expenses for construction. And finally, when the projects are finished, you're going to see pretty much enough property tax to come in to pay the debt service. So it'll be a wash. But that's not going to happen until these projects are finished. And I'm not sure if I'm making that clear, but that's why these things look like they go up and down. We're only measuring a 12-month period when we add up all the revenues and expenses. But you can't forget about the fund balance. And if you look at your ordinance and also the budget summary, I did break it down by estimated beginning fund balances, the revenues and the expenditures contained in the budget that's being proposed, what the surplus or deficit is, and what the estimated ending fund balance will be. And I'm happy to report in every case there is fund balance available in all 14 of the city's funds.
If we could have the lights back on. I want to thank Maggie Powers, our city treasurer Evelyn Struck, Christine Winger, finance chairman, and vice chairman Joe Coles for their hard work on the budget. Thank you, Mr. Subak. Now is the time for any citizens who wish to make any comments or any questions regarding the budget. If you'll go to the podium and give us your name and address and tell us your thoughts. Hearing none, may I have a motion to adjourn the public hearing?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Thank you. Thank you as well. Call to order the special meeting of the City Council. Roll call, please.
Alderman Knight.
Here.
Alderman Coles.
Here.
Alderman Peisig.
Here.
Alderman Shockey.
Here.
Alderman Subak.
Here.
Alderman Talame.
Here.
Alderman Winger.
Here.
Alderman Wesley.
Here.
Mayor Johnson.
Here, quorum is once again present. Would you stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Have a proclamation I'd like to make at this time from the Office of the Mayor to celebrate Arbor Day. Whereas in 1872, J. Sterling Morton proposed to the Nebraska Board of Agriculture that a special day be set aside for the planting of trees. And whereas this holiday, called Arbor Day, was first observed with the planting of more than 1 million trees in Nebraska. And whereas Arbor Day is now observed throughout the nation and the world. And whereas trees can reduce the erosion of our precious topsoil by wind and water, cut heating and cooling costs, moderate the temperature, clean the air, produce life-giving oxygen, and provide habitat for wildlife. And whereas trees are a renewable resource, giving us paper, wood for our homes, fuel for our fires, and beautify our community. And whereas trees in our cities increase property values, enhance the economic vitality of business areas, and beautify our community. And whereas trees, wherever they are planted, are a source of joy and spiritual renewal. Now therefore, I, Kenneth P. Johnson, Mayor of the City of Wooddale, Illinois, do hereby proclaim Friday, April 28, 2006 as Arbor Day in the City of Wooddale, and I urge all citizens to celebrate Arbor Day and to support efforts to protect our trees and woodlands. Further, I urge all citizens to plant trees to gladden the heart and promote the well-being of this and future generations. In witness whereof I have set my hand and caused the Great Seal of Wooddale to be affixed this date. And speaking of Arbor Day, it is appropriate that the City of Wooddale has been officially proclaimed to be a tree city, USA. The City of Wooddale is very proud to announce that we have joined 182 other cities in the U.S. as a tree city. And thanks to Alderman Winger for her long work on this, and I think Alderman Zobek for years was working on this as a project as well. We are officially welcome to the elite group of communities that actively manage their tree resources and have met all of the Tree City USA requirements. We have waited many years to achieve this designation. The Arbor Day Foundation, along with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and the Division of Forest Resources, sponsor the Tree City USA program. The Illinois Tree City USA program is well regarded in the country and is highly respected and sought after recognition in Illinois. There are many requirements to fulfill as a tree city. One of the requirements is that the city must spend a minimum of $2 per capita on local tree care. Illinois Tree City USA communities spend an average of $11.59 per capita, with the highest per capita recorded at $59 per capita. The City of Wooddale has made a commitment to spend about $4 to $5 per capita in the next year's budget. The funds are a combination of efforts, including the Parkway Tree Replacement Program, the Forestry Program, as well as funds appropriated for the Streetscape Committee, landscaping, and beautification efforts. My thanks to Jeff Miramuse, Mimi Anderson, and Gary and the entire City Services Department who worked on this project. The foundation has sent us some literature, which you're free to peruse and take home with you. Just some interesting facts regarding the value of trees to a community. Alderman Ptolemy, you'll appreciate this. Trees can be a stimulus to economic development, attracting new businesses and tourism. Commercial retail areas are more attractive to shoppers. Apartments rent more quickly, tenants stay longer, and space in a wooded setting is more valuable to sell and rent, according to the National Arbor Day Foundation. According to the USDA Forest Service, healthy mature trees add an average of 10% to the value of one's property. Again, according to the USDA Forest Service, the planting of trees means improved water quality, resulting in less runoff and erosion. This allows more recharging of the groundwater supply. Wooded areas help prevent the transport of sediment and chemicals into our streams. And according to Dr. Roger Ehrlich of Texas A&M University, in laboratory research, visual exposure to trees, this is something we can all take to heart, visual exposure to trees, settings with trees, has produced significant recovery from stress within 5 minutes, as indicated by changes in blood pressure and muscle tension. Interesting thoughts.
Can we
So
bring
we have
some
it-
in here?
Plant a tree in the middle of it, yeah.
So the Arbor Foundation has given us this plaque, Tree City USA, National Arbor Day Foundation, City of Wooddale, 2006. Do you want my hat on?
Yes.
Complete with hat.
Where's the shovel?
That's in my office. We got it? And that brings us to item 11. May I have a motion to approve an ordinance approving the budget for the city of Wooddale for fiscal year 2006, 2007?
So moved.
Is there such a motion? There is. Is there a second?
Second.
There is a second on the question. Alderman Ptolemy.
Question. I wanted to do this, Megan, when you were giving your presentation, but was told I couldn't. On the last page that was up there with the breakdown, okay, all the breakdowns, could you explain, please, for the public, which ones that we need to maintain specific balances in? Because I think there may be some misunderstanding. You know, some of these accounts or some of these funds, we could, if we wanted to, we could get them down to zero. But there are some, I mean, I know you pointed out the capital projects, but could you explain, you know, I mean, for example, like the general fund, and how many months that represents for the city?
Certainly. The state of Illinois recommends that municipalities have 8 months of their total expenditures for the year in their fund balance. And Wooddale is going to end up with about 7.3 months at the end of 2006-07. If we calculated this out, the state would say we should have, I'm sorry. I misspoke there. The state's saying we should have $6.9 million, and we're going to have $7,049,000.
Right, and
We're
we've
gonna-
actually.
We're going to be a little higher.
If I could interject here, I just want to make it real clear. The 7.4 or the 7,049,000 is actually more than we've had for a couple of years, because there were a couple of years where we were down to 5 months, and I believe there was one time a couple of years ago where we were down 4 months in our total budget.
And that may
So-
be, it was before my time here.
It
but
was.
It
It was.
happens with, it happens for various reasons. One of the reasons why the general fund, which is the fund where we pay most of our payroll and where most city services come from, is because of our reliance on other types of revenue. The state shares revenues with municipalities. And if they were to run into economic difficulties, which they already have in the state of Illinois, but to the extent that they could not disperse funds to municipalities, we would obviously have to keep making payroll. keep making utility payments, keep paying for goods and services for a certain amount of time. So that's why you need to have some cushion just for that sort of thing to happen. The only other fund that really needs to have a balance is the water and sewer operating fund, and that's because we have payroll expenses there too, gasoline expenses, things that can't wait. You're absolutely correct that the capital projects fund could come to zero, and nothing could be spent until more revenue arrives in that fund.
And the council has already pretty much said that next year, you know, and I think you pointed it out, the revenue, we usually get at least 2.1, almost 2.2 million. And you pointed out, or the council's already pretty much said that next year, we're not going to be doing roads and streets. So that 2.1 or almost $2.2 million will come in and replenish that fund.
That's right.
And it'll go, I mean, it'll be in addition to the 644,000 that's currently restricted.
Right, 'cause
So,
that-
but that
that's
won't be
exactly right.
restricted.
No, it won't be.
Correct.
That would be unrestricted.
Okay.
And just to finish giving you a complete answer to your question, clearly monies that are in the special service area or the police pension fund are not available at all to the city.
Correct.
Those are trust funds. So every penny that's in those funds can only be used for their specific purpose. And then the other restrictions on special revenue funds are that if you have any fund balance at all, it can only be used for the purpose for which the special revenue is earned. Motor fuel tax is my best example. Unless IDOT approves the expenditure, you can't spend motor fuel tax monies. Tourism fund has to be spent only to promote tourism. So those are the sort of restrictions. But really, the general fund and the water and sewer operating fund are where we expect to have available cash. We must have that in order to keep operating, just as a business would do.
Okay. The only other comment that I have is really, and this is, I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank the city staff. I think you folks did a great job this year with the budget. I know I've been doing the budgets or been involved for 10 years now, and I will tell you that from my perspective, I've seen some pretty lousy budgets, okay, over the course of the 10 years. And this budget, for the first time, I honestly feel comfortable that all of the balances are true. I mean, the numbers, for the first time, the numbers that are being stated here are true numbers, and we're not playing a shell game as, you know, some people have said we were doing. And I would like to commend you and city staff. I think you folks did a great job, as well as the chairman of the Finance Committee and the treasurer.
Thank you, Alderman Ptolemy.
Any other comments or questions? Alderman Knight?
Maggie, correct me if I'm wrong. When you subtract the expenditures or the revenues from the expenditures, we still are going to have a $3.91 million deficit
In what fund, sir?
in total budget.
No, you have to do it by fund. You can't add them together like that.
Well, that's what you did. You got grand total estimate revenue, all funds, 22 million.
Well, that's just for
Expenditures.
the state filing. That's, the statute requires that. But you don't want to put all those funds together and compare the revenue and expenses, because my point about special service area is probably the best reason for that. You're never going to have revenues and expenditures match in special service area due to the nature of the fund. And it's not because of any reckless spending. It's because of the way the expenditures will be timed, and those go based on the bond ordinance and also on the construction schedules. So there's no way you won't have, I mean, you get the bonds 1 year, you don't spend that money for the next 3 years. So that's, you don't really want to do that and compare it that way. What you want to do is look at this and see it by fund.
Oh, you sure confused me then.
Alderman Shockey?
Yeah, I'd like to try and clear something up in my mind. We're talking now about that this year, Ward 1 will be finished with the streets, and we're not going to be doing any streets next year, but we're still showing a budget estimate of $1,200,000. can you kind of put this into perspective? The other, couple of meetings ago, you were asked, what's the good thing about doing all the streets? And you asked Finance Director, I think you gave a very good positive reason why we should be doing all the streets now. As long as we've had, though, a deficit of 280,000, and the year before, a deficit of 601,000, 2004, deficit of 214,000. As Finance Director, can you give me the opposite side of the picture as well, and tell me why it's not a good idea to spend more than what we're taking in, and to have been doing this now for 4 out of the past 5 years?
Well, part of it is because, as I say, of timing differences. But at some point, obviously, you would have to borrow from another fund. If you committed the city to an expenditure and the monies didn't materialize, then another fund would have to cover that deficit.
Now, you mentioned
That's what would
also,
happen.
you were questioned about borrowing this year from another fund if necessary, and you said, well, that's not a good idea, and then you were stopped right at that point.
Yeah.
You weren't allowed to go any further. I'm just wondering why it's not a good idea then.
Well, it's not a good idea because of what I said earlier about these types of funds and how they each have their own purpose. We didn't come up with this breakdown arbitrarily. The Government Accounting Standards Board basically dictates how municipalities are to report their operations financially. So these funds have specific purposes. Having said that, it is perfectly legitimate to take motor fuel tax monies that IDOT has approved for a roadway project and report the expenditure in capital projects because of the nature of the project, all right? And that's been done for years, and that's perfectly appropriate. There's no problem there. All the approvals are taken care of. What would be inappropriate would be taking narcotics forfeiture money and throwing it in the general fund and saying, well, we'll just put it against the police expenditures. Because narcotics forfeiture money, by law, is supposed to be reserved for narcotics enforcement. So we report it as a special revenue, and right now the city of Wooddale, I'm not saying the only enforcement we do is the K-9 program, but that's the one that gets used against those
We're
revenues.
talking about the capital projects now, though.
Right.
And you still haven't given me anything from the other side of the book. I mean, you're still talking about positive things. I'd like to know what possible negative things are for spending more money than we have, than we have coming in. Are there any as finance director, are there any negative things that
No,
we
just
should-
what I said about putting yourself into a borrowing position. If you
Which
were
means what?
to spend more, well, you would have to borrow someplace, issue a bond, borrow from another fund, borrow from a bank.
So issuing a bond means that we'd have to borrow money and then pay back 150% of that money over time?
Sure, if you did it for a long enough term. I mean, that's how large construction projects that are going to have a long useful life are sometimes financed. So, and there's a lot of communities who do that, do
So in
bond
other words,
issues.
there's a lot of advantages of doing all this now, the street projects now. The only disadvantages is that we may run out of money and have to take a bond issue for our
Well-
day-to-day, from our year-to-year expenses then.
Oh, no. I've never heard of anyone doing a bond issue to pay for operating expenses, and there aren't any day-to-day expenses in the capital projects fund. There are only capital projects.
I thought you just said that
There's
we
no-
would need to do that if we kept spending more for streets than we have actually coming in.
No, there aren't any, there's no personnel expenses in the capital projects fund, no payroll taxes, only capital projects. That's all that comes out of that fund.
Right?
Okay, so what I was saying is, if you didn't have adequate revenues to cover your projects, you would have to borrow the funds if you had committed to a project that was underway, that a contractor needed to be paid on.
You'd have to borrow from other funds.
You could try that first,
You
or you could
can-
go to a bank, or you could do a bond issue.
Take from Paul to pay Peter then, that type of thing.
Well, borrowing is borrowing. It's debt.
And how long can you go on doing this, actually, running a deficit before you run into real problems?
Running a deficit in the
Well,
capital
how
projects
long can
fund,
you keep spending more money in an area in one fund than you have coming in, and continue to do so.
I don't think there's an answer to that question. How long you could do that?
This Minerva, where it'll go on forever?
I've given you my best answer, sir. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Alderman Subak.
In years past, I look at the general fund, we have a deficit proposed of $130,000. I believe 2 years ago, the budget that was passed had about an $800,000 deficit. When the actual numbers came in, there was actually a surplus. I think last year, the year before, we had about a $600,000 estimate for a deficit. When the actual numbers came in, it was a surplus. So I'm proud to say that since I've been on the council, maybe we've passed deficit budgets, but actually when the actual numbers come in, it's always been a surplus, so that's actually a positive. Every year we hear the same thing about the streets. We have some members of the council want to move forward and get streets done. Some members want to save and wait. And it unfortunately becomes a ward issue. I heard the first ward. I always joke about ward projects with respect to streets, but I think I've been consistent in advocating whenever a street comes up that we need to get this done. But this budget isn't just about streets. It's about we're adding personnel to the building department to make sure we have the housing issue code violations addressed. We're adding another police officer to make sure that our residents are safe, and we're adequately compensating all the employees that we have. So nobody's brought anything else up but just the streets. As part of the street projects this year, they're tied to water projects. We raised the rates of the residents to pay for new water mains and to pay for new sewer mains because our infrastructure is aging. It's 40, 50, 60 years old, and it's crumbling. Last year we heard, will the world fall apart if we just wait and do Stoneham next year? Do we have to do Stoneham? I drove it. It looks fine. It can wait. And guess what? We did Stoneham, and the world didn't fall in because we did it, and it's done and it's over. Based upon last year's numbers for rates we got for Stoneham, if this year's projects we waited, and we're paying about $2.2 million for these projects, if we would have bought those last year, they would have been done at about $1.8 million. So again, it's my position that we're actually saving money by getting these projects done and put on the shelf because everybody would agree the infrastructure is old and needs to be replaced. We issued a bond for the special service area. That's a bond for the industrial park. It's not a bond that the city's going to pay. The original proposal from the city council a couple years ago was that the city should pay 50% on those roads. Nobody said boo, and all of a sudden Alderman Winger and I, sitting down with Craig, our old city services director, said, why are we going to pay 50% on that? He said, okay, let's pay 25%. And we said, then why are we even going to pay that? So through the work through the capital projects, vice chairman and chairman, we actually got Wooddale to shift all that to the responsibility of the industrial park, which is a great thing because it saved the residents